Hi, everyone. My name is Addison Nace, and I am a second-year PhD student here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Design Studies. And Marina and I have been planning this week-long celebration symposium, so you'll probably be hearing a lot from us. And I'm just going to introduce both of our presenters for this afternoon, and then we can get started. So Grant Johnson is a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art and a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. His research on textiles underscores their dynamic presence across contemporary culture, especially within the intertwined worlds of art, craft, and fashion. His research has been supported by the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Del Amo Foundation, and the Association of Historians of American Art. He was a Jane and Morgan Whitney Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 2019 to 2020, and is a frequent contributor to publications including Art Forum, Frieze, and the Journal of Modern Craft. And Jennifer Lindsay has served as the president of the Center for Knit and Crochet since 2015. Jennifer works in the Washington, D.C. area as a consultant to develop and deliver creative programs, exhibitions, and public art installation, merging art, science, social and environmental justice issues, and hands-on crafting. In leading the Center for Knit and Crochet, Jennifer draws on her experiences of inspiring museums, schools, and community organizations to explore these spaces of mutual innovation. Jennifer has been a speaker, moderator, guest lecturer, and instructor at numerous conferences and events, including AASLH, AAM, TSA, NSF, and NMHNH. She is the curator and creator of 4 exhibitions on textiles and contemporary craft. She co-created and coordinated 2 large-scale community fiber arts projects, the Smithsonian Community Reef for the National Museum of Natural History, and the Artisphere Yarn Bomb. Her scholarly articles on knitting, community art practice, and public engagement strategies for museums appear in the Textile Society of America's Biennial Symposium proceedings, Rowan and Littlefield's Innovative Approaches in Museum series, and the Journal of Modern Craft. Jennifer holds an MA in the History of Decorative Arts from the Corcoran College of Art and Design, now affiliated with the George Washington University. Her master's thesis, Mary Walker Phillips, Creative Knitting and the Cranbrook Experience, 2010, documents the emergence of knitting as contemporary art. And thank you everyone so much for being here. And I love that everyone is introducing themselves in the chat, so please feel free to do that. We're going to get started with Grant Johnson's presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions for him before moving on to Jennifer's talk.
So I'll just go right ahead, yes. I'm so happy to be here, and thanks to all of you for joining me today for this. And when I saw the call for papers, I thought, well, I ought to try to be involved in this. And so I hope that what I offer in the next so many minutes feels relevant to you and feels relevant to the very interesting interdisciplinary conversations that I've already witnessed and been inspired by. I am, as I've been framed to some degree, interested in speaking about my experience in the last year as a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It might be worth going into just a little bit of detail what that role entailed pre-COVID and then also post-COVID. It meant that I was a in-house educator, mostly working with college and adult populations and working primarily in person, giving exhibition tours that often came from my particular interpretive angle, were developed entirely by me and other teaching fellows working alongside of me, sometimes also courses as well. And so really the transition to remote programming was something that I had never done in that role previously, but has really been the bulk of what that role has been in the last year. And so partially I'm sharing with you, or will share with you, my the first remote program that I came up with once the museum closed and we pivoted to online education in various formats. I'm one of many educators sort of extending the Whitney into people's homes, but also one that was, I think, particularly relevant to the questions that the museum's closure and also the what the series ultimately became called, Art History from Home, which has a nice resonance with this conference itself, Textiles from Home. How sort of taking those, that prompt seriously and maybe a bit philosophically led me to think about things differently than I would have been if we had still been, or were still, largely in person doing tours in the building. So with that, I've got already this textile work on the screen for several moments, and it's Rosie Lee Tompkins' 3 Sixes. And it showed up to my great pleasure as part of a show called Making Knowing that features craft in American art from roughly 1950 through to the present, to very recent acquisitions into the Whitney's permanent collection. So it's drawn primarily from collection works, and most of what I'll show you as I go on are all collection works. And it was a startling thing to see in that show, maybe even more than other startling things to be pleasantly surprised at in that show, because it wasn't just textile implied or textile adjacent, but truly felt like a textile and an object that, as a quilt, could exist in other museum collections that have different collecting histories and different sort of definitions of what art is or a museum collection should entail than the Whitney has historically. Something you could do right now that kind of bears out a little bit of my point here is go to the Whitney's collection website, and like many a collection website, you can choose to search by medium, and you'll find that there's really only a handful of things categorized as textiles in the museum's collection. And the bulk of the collection is made up of maybe things more historically associated with art as a kind of museological definition. So painting, sculptures, photography, things like that. And so happy to see this, true textile, not quasi-textile, this quilt in the collection, and also to get to work with it as an educator. And one of the things that I started to think about it, especially once the museum was closed, is that this was a work as a quilt that in some ways seemed as equally likely to find in a museum, if not to find in a home. And so it was maybe easier to imagine it and have some sense of sympathy with it, imagining it from your home or engaging with it as part of a home-based museum at home education project than maybe seeing it in the museum, where in fact it in some ways may feel a little estranged from a kind of domestic context. And so with that, I started to think about this idea of domestic aesthetics, which in one way of sort of defining it is about going through your home, and if you can't go to a museum, appreciating your home as if it were a museum. And then before I move on from the Tompkins example, and it really did sort of generate all of these ideas that I think you'll see me sort of developing in other works, I want to also say that we know that for Tompkins, this work in particular had a biographical significance. 3 Sixes is a reference to 3 relatives of hers who all had 6 somewhere in their birthday. And so a kind of numerological reference, but also knowing that she was a devout Christian and very serious about her faith, a potential reference to the idea of the Holy Trinity. And so a kind of moment, at least in my interpretation, where she is toggling and making this quilt and associating these sort of biographical and symbolic meanings with it, toggling between the autobiographical and the personal, which is something I would associate with a kind of immediate experience of one's home environment, one's day-to-day, but then also connecting to something bigger than oneself and beyond one's home, whether it be a sort of sense of Christian spirituality or something more secular, and some greater sense of connection as well. And so here in this work, I feel like just in the sort of appreciation of it as a made thing, and here I give you a detail on the right-hand side where you can also see that this idea of 3 Sixes kind of bears out formally as well if you look at the quilt squares going across the strips that make up the squares, you get 3 and 3 adding up to a line of 6 before it becomes another square. So at the level of making, there seemed to be a kind of formal conceit happening here that put Tompkins in this sense of biographical and autobiographical connection with her relatives and family, but then also with something beyond this kind of family existence and domestic feeling to become something more worldly as well. And so that's an idea that I'm interested in throughout and really got going in thinking about this work. So I hope I'm already sort of, on the one hand, giving you the talk that I've given several times already over the course of the last year, but also kind of drawing back the curtain a little bit. And if you have questions in the Q&A, we can maybe get a little bit more meta. Here's another work trying to give this idea some historical depth that I reached for that in fact is not in Making Knowing, because that show deals with things after 1950. So it's a work by Charles Sheeler called Interior. And this one I think is a really great example. And some of these I'm not going to give full due because I've sort of shrunk this talk down for the 20 minutes allotted to me. So if you do have questions about particular things, feel free to circle back. But I really think it's a great and provocative example of this idea of the sort of home as a museum, knowing that this was in fact Sheeler's actual home at one point, and he is making this painting in his house, and these are objects that he is already living with. And it seems, the painting I think suggests to us that he has arranged his home in a particular way and arranged these objects in a kind of almost museological way with this picture on this very spindly legged table to suggest something that feels very presentational and ordered in a way that a museum would be, and doesn't sort of feel necessarily set up for the convenient patterns or rhythms of actually moving around this room. It seems like a body, if it tried to travel between that tiny table and that very large table, might start to knock into things. And so it has the kind of presentation or setup that we might associate with a museum. And also, of course, textiles are in this room and a kind of major player in both the compositional jigsaw that it's setting forth, but also I think this kind of meditation that Sheeler is putting out of a kind of canon of American craft that is interestingly not structured around paintings, even though he himself is a painter, but seems to be structured around these Americana craft objects, whether we're thinking about the picture or the tables or the plate or the textiles. It all seems to add up to a kind of American art, decorative art canon. And then I jump forward in time to Miriam Schapiro's The Beauty of Summer from 1973 to 1974. And many of you may know her work, in particular her notion of femage, which was her interest in bringing together collaged elements, bits of wallpaper. In this example, you can see particularly well these scarves that she's collaged down, so fully integral, not chopped up pieces of fabric. And particularly in her mind, all of these different samples or collaged pieces carry some sense of a feminine association. And in her mind, that leads to a feminist activist suggestion, as she at the time was a leader of the then nascent emerging feminist art movement. And this work, I think, is particularly interesting to the kind of tensions maybe inherent in the larger talk, in that Shapiro is consistently interested in understanding herself as an artist. She's interested in craft, she's interested in the decorative, she's interested in the domestic, but she brings those things that she sees as registers of femininity or domesticity or decorativeness into the space of painting, and often sort of keeps it in that kind of medial reference. So I think it's important to appreciate that we're looking at something that is still a rectangle here, still takes that kind of painterly motif, even though it is pointing to the world of craft. I don't think Shapiro quite literally or even sort of conceptually was interested in thinking of herself as a craftsperson, as a kind of movement of craft into art. I think it's interesting and important to kind of pay attention to those shifts, these kind of categorical shifts, and also self-styling. And then from there, to kind of extend the feminist meditation and maybe a little bit of historical revision, I stepped towards this work by Mike Kelly called More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid and the Wages of Sin. And partially want to make the point that there's a, though no men were permitted to participate in the feminist art movement started at Cal Arts in Southern California. There were men at Cal Arts otherwise at the time, and then also following the emergence of the feminist art program in the early 1970s, led by Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago. And I think you can start to imagine a kind of continuity between the formal questions that Shapiro is asking and then potentially Kelly is continuing or answering. You have, again, a work that is very much a collage of found elements, but now they are sculptural elements and different kinds of textile objects found in used contexts, so Salvation Armies, Goodwill, things like that. And this is important to Kelly because it ties into the idea of the title, that these are all objects that at some point represented a kind of love exchange between people, parents and children, family members, lovers, grandparents and grandchildren. If you are maybe looking at various objects, you can get sort of different associations, and that there was always going to be a kind of inequality in these exchanges where you could never repay those kind of love debts, especially because these objects, as he's finding them, end up in a discarded context, or a context where they'll have to be appropriated for some other family's use potentially. And so suggesting a kind of debt that can never be fully repaid. And then the wages of sin relates more to the candles on the left-hand side. And again, if you have questions about that, I can go into more detail. But he is also working in Southern California, trying to reference his Midwestern upbringing in Michigan, middle class, and also a distinct sort of particular sense of a domestic interior. So the kind of home, Midwestern home, where you would truly find all of these things or some of these things, and then also maybe a place where someone is decorating with the corn husks, the festive corn husks you see in the upper right and left-hand corner. And the whole thing is supposed to feel a bit like some kind of mysterious ritual altar of sorts. And then I'm wanting to try to move into other mediums. I have this work here by Latoya Ruby Frazier, who is herself pictured in the photograph while also staging and taking the photograph as the photographer. And she's trying to recover some sense of family history in Braddock, Pennsylvania, where she is from, and her family still in some part lives, and particularly drawing attention to, and I think this photograph suggests a kind of elegy or mourning or a lifestyle lost as the home itself is sort of falling apart, the ways in which Braddock, as part of the Rust Belt, has seen the departure of jobs and heavy industry that would have previously afforded social mobility, a certain middle-class lifestyle, the ability to buy, move into, and make a house like this truly a home, and now has left many of them, maybe like this one, abandoned. And then in particular, she's wrapping herself in, as the title suggests, her grandfather's blanket. And so here, another moment where the textile comes in and takes on a kind of, again, maybe like the Kelly, a ritual or sort of incantatory significance where an autobiographical sense of connection is very much going on. I've got an eye on the time, so I'm moving on to what is the last work in my collection, and that's the work of Marie Wad, which sort of brings us pretty close to the present and occupies the last sort of chronological room in the show. And it's called Skywalker Skyscraper, as you can see, and takes sort of the form of a skyscraper. Wad said she was interested moving herself from the Pacific Northwest to near to New York, moving to Brooklyn, New York City, interested in the kind of change of motif from conifers, she says, in the Pacific Northwest as the kind of dominant vertical element, or other kinds of pine trees, to actual skyscrapers in and around New York City. And so making a work that is a kind of monument to acknowledgement of those skyscrapers, but then in particular, a indigenous, maybe we could say craft history or history of making associated with those skyscrapers. And that is the acknowledgement of, or allusion to, the so-called Iroquois ironworkers, who were often referred to as skywalkers, and employed in the creation, the erection of skyscrapers, particularly at the most dangerous moments of their coming into being, where people are walking across girders and joining things together very high above the ground. And so again, a work that I think has a kind of monumental presence and illusion and suggests a kind of monument in that sense, a monument to these workers and their history. And building on this indigenous idea, all of these reclaimed wool blankets suggest the importance that blankets often have in various indigenous communities. Watt herself is a member of the Seneca Nation, and so she is very often thinking about these sort of themes of indigenous identity in her work. And with that, I'm going to allow for the question portion to try and stay as much as possible on time, but hopefully you feel like there's more to talk about and we can turn to some discussion now.
Thank you so much for that, Grant. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to, I believe there should, under the reactions, there should be a raising your hand function, or pop a question into the chat.
I see a question in the chat. Should I just go ahead and answer it? Catherine asks, is there a reading list or bibliography related to the Making Knowing exhibition? Great question. Partially, I'll start by acknowledging that the exhibition itself is not my brainchild, and to some degree, I'm riffing off of it and around it. It was curated by a curatorial team of primarily three at the Whitney: Elizabeth Sherman, Jenny Goldstein, and Ambika Trasi. And going to the Whitney's website, whether on the audio guide, if you go to whitney.org/guide, or if you take a look at the exhibition page, it'll lead you to other links that will, I think, give you some, not necessarily a reading list or a bibliography in the traditional sense, but will start to point you in various directions that'll lead you on other rabbit holes. And it is quite a large show with a lot in it, and I've really only shown you the tip of the iceberg. So a lot on the Whitney's website. And if you have sort of questions beyond that, I can sort of fill in more, but I get the sense this is a very knowing crowd. So a lot of what I've said draws from existing histories, whether they are of feminist art or contemporary craft or things like that. So, you know, the work of Julie Bryant Wilson, Jenny Sorkin, Glenn Adamson. You're welcome. Please talk more about seeing your home as a museum. Well, I think I have another slide in here that I didn't necessarily plan on bringing in, but I think I can go to it and give you some sense of how I took this. Originally, these talks were billed as domestic aesthetics, and I imagined them as a kind of, or they became a kind of three-part series. This was sort of part one, where we were grounded very much in the idea of textiles, and then I moved into more of a meditation on this idea, particularly of sort of recognizing your house as a museum. And that idea really got started, or I really wanted to talk about this work by Carol Bove, which maybe because I was only tentatively thinking about bringing it in, doesn't give you a material list, but basically what you're seeing is what you get. These are found books, and yeah, mostly books on a shelf that very much looks like a shelf that, you know, you could buy in a sort of high-minded design context or office supply situation. And looking closely at those books, you might get a sense of them belonging to a particular kind of home or a particular kind of people. They are mostly books that would be typical of a kind of 1970s counterculture existence. So they suggest, or a countercultural reading list, going back to the idea of bibliography. And so they sort of allude to or suggest both A's own biography growing up in the Bay Area, in and around Berkeley and San Francisco and Oakland, in the 1970s and 1980s. And so this was a work for me that, you know, installed as it is here on a museum wall shelf, or on a museum wall, the shelves are part of the artwork, suggest the kind of preconditions that an artist might assume for a museum display, and something then strange, I think, philosophically happens if you say to yourself, well, what happens if I'm an art collector? Or what if I somehow end up with this work in my home? Does it still look and register as a sort of gesture of conceptual art or ready-made sculpture, or does it start to blend into the things that are already in my home? And am I allowed to use this as a functional shelf and put my own books on it, in addition to the books that Beauvais has selected as part of the art piece? And so this is I'm throwing in a specific example here to answer your question, but I think this is one direction in which this kind of philosophical question can go. If we're truly interested in bringing the museum home in one way or another, how does that unsettle our expectations of what an art object is, and even our ability to recognize one object as an art object versus a non-art object? Maybe recognizing your home as a museum encourages you to really think about everything that is in your home as having an aesthetic potential. And I think generally that's something I believe and I think is true. It just maybe takes a shift of perception and appreciation. I'm seeing another question, and please just somebody pull me off the stage when it's time to move on to something else. From Marina, Grant, thanks so much. This is a really wonderful collection of works. I'd love to hear about your experiences of the reception of your education programs. Who broadly has participated and how have they responded to these works and this idea of accessing the museum from home? So this is a really interesting question, and to some degree, the way to answer it, I'm going to go back to, I don't know, maybe something else, just to give you something else to look at. To some degree, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, if we've been using Zoom or teaching in one way or another via Zoom or via some other sort of remote format, you can't totally know who you're engaging with and who is participating in the same way that you would if you were engaging with 25 people suddenly showing up at the museum for a tour, and it's a class studying X or Y, or people with coming from a certain background, and so you can't know people in some sense, but then also you, I think, can know people, or I have over the last year gotten a sense of audiences that is very distinct from maybe the sense I got or the sort of intimacy and immediacy I got from audiences prior to the museum's closure or prior to remote programming. Often the questions I'm getting at the end of talks are more like the questions I would expect in an advanced graduate seminar than the ones I would have tended to have gotten at the end of a tour in person. And so that suggests a kind of difference of maybe who's coming or the kind of engagement that's happening. Not to suggest one is better or worse, but that's one difference that increasingly has been remarkable. And the other thing to say, to make a kind of general statement that maybe a lot of people are experiencing, is that the ratio of who were engaging, or how many, just simply how many people were engaging, has exponentially shot up. So, whereas generally just sort of crowd control stipulations and museum functionality questions where we can only have so many people moving around the floor at any one time as a big group, means that tours were limited to basically 25 people at a time. Now when I give a talk, it is, it fluctuates week to week or talk to talk, but they are consistently somewhere between 400 and 700 people in any one talk. And that's a huge number of people. That would be a large lecture hall in any other context. And so I think it's right to say that we're probably reaching more people, or just to take me as an example, I'm reaching more people more quickly, more immediately than I would be otherwise via this format. And I think probably a more international contingent as well, if people can sort of all show up at noon or 6 p.m., which is when they tend to happen, and they happen live. So it's you don't have to come to the museum in person, which one thinks would lead you to engage people who weren't previously engaging. So
thank you so much, Grant.
Yeah.
So if anyone has other questions, they can definitely keep the conversation going in the chat, but I think we will move on to Jennifer's half of this session.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Well, hello, and thank you very much. And Grant, that was so interesting, and so many things are resonating for me as a result of seeing those works. It was really, really moving. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen now and hope that this will work. Let's see here. I think what I want is this. Okay. So as Addison noted, I am the president of the Center for Knit and Crochet. And you're looking now at the Center for Knit and Crochet's website. Our organization was established in 2012, as a matter of fact, in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the physical home of this virtual conference, at a symposium coordinated by our founder and president, Karen Kendrick Hands, to explore the possibility of developing a physical museum for knitting and crochet. And I was one of 50 attendees at this conference, and I was actually asked to speak at the conference. There were many different stakeholders who attended the conference that Karen had reached out to, including yarn manufacturers, designers, publishers in the knitting industry, guild members, makers, scholars, and many others. And all of those museum professionals, all of those individuals contributed discussions for the weekend and ultimately voted on the direction for the birth of this organization. And I attended and spoke about developing the Center for Knit and Crochet as a digital rather than a physical entity. Because as a knitting scholar, I realized that we really needed to bring disparate collections together. And Karen's particular interests in starting the museum could also be addressed. And her two main interests were that museums often had collections of knitting and crochet that were not being exhibited for various reasons, including lack of scholarship, potentially lack of space, potentially the condition of the items. And in 2012, museums did not have as many digitized objects as they do today. So she was concerned that those objects were not being shared in exhibitions and that potentially the cataloging of them was incorrect or incomplete. And second, that many makers that she knew in her community wanted to have a place to share their own objects, preserve their own objects in the future. And as a museum professional, I understood that without sufficient scholarship, it makes it very difficult for museums to share objects that they even have in their collections if there's insufficient information about those objects. So one way to address that it was to develop the CKC as a digital museum, which would be affordable and sustainable, and to find ways to create conversations between communities with knowledge about knitted and crocheted objects and encourage the type of sharing that would fill out these museum records to make the objects more viable to show, and would begin to capture the knowledge of makers in the records for the objects. Not only so that the records themselves would be more accurate and complete as to the materials and techniques and history of the object, but also so that they could be discoverable when digitized by people who make things using terminology and that's customary amongst makers. So the idea behind the Center for Knit and Crochet, which is a nonprofit organization that is all volunteer run. The idea is that we would create this space where these interactions could happen, that we could function much like a traditional museum by creating exhibitions and other types of programs, but that we would also try to build a collections resource that would allow museums and collecting organizations to share their objects, and that would also have a potential for individuals to share their objects as well. So this organization has been under development since 2012 with basically a generation of really talented, incredibly dedicated board members who bring lots of types of expertise to the organization. And it's through their labors and ingenuity that we exist today in the form that we are. And I just wanted to give you a quick tour of some of the things that are available on the website, and then introduce you to the collections resources that are open for you. The idea behind this is that it's free and accessible to anyone at any time, 24/7, that you don't have to be enrolled in a school to become a scholar, that scholars are made every second of the day when someone becomes inspired by something, and that inspiration is created through access. And so this entire venture is to elevate the arts of knitting and crochet, make them accessible so they survive into the future, and to capture and share all of our individual histories as makers more effectively with one another and with museum professionals who are not a mutually exclusive group, because many museum professionals also love to make. So very quickly, you can learn about CKC, our board and volunteers here. You can, we are a member organization, so you can join by following our membership link. It's very simple. It costs $10 for an annual membership. You can become involved in the leadership of the Center for Knit and Crochet by becoming an annual member, and we do have board openings now. So if this inspires you, we'd be interested to hear from you. We have a blog that anyone can contribute to. You do not have to be a member of the Center for Knit and Crochet to contribute information to the blog. We're really just interested in creating a platform where people can do scholarship and share scholarship that advances our maker communities and the field as a whole. We also have social media feed that you can follow. And one of our primary efforts, Suzanne Thompson, who will be speaking later this week on her doily exhibition, is our social media coordinator. And she combs our two archives for various types of information all about makers and who is making, and does a wonderful job of sharing this in our social media feed, bringing you directly back to the archives themselves. And so I'll just quickly take you to, we have collections, include an exhibition that we created in 2016 on Sanker gloves, which is a very small and rare type of knitting. We were excited to co-create this exhibition with two curators who are experts in this knitting tradition. And the exhibition itself creates a model that we're hoping to pursue in future exhibitions, where you are able to learn about the tradition itself, the characteristics of the gloves that are their defining characteristics, the regional contexts in which they are made, various types of recognizable patterns and variations. There is a lot of technical information about how the gloves are made that makers would appreciate knowing. We look at contemporary examples and museum examples. I love this particular adaptation of the technique, which is the Sand QR glove. And just following this through the history so that you see contemporary makers. We want to connect you with new designers who are using the technique and the curators themselves, as well as bibliographies that allow you to pursue the subject yourself, so that we can continue the momentum around the scholarship. And this exhibit was very popular with visitors, and also inspired a focus on Sanker knitting that Vogue Knitting magazine did in 2017. So we feel like this organization can contribute to revitalizing some forgotten and unappreciated knitting techniques, and we can do more of this in the future. One of the difficulties of it is that it is all volunteer, and that it was very time consuming to do. So as we are looking ahead into developing new exhibitions, we are trying to think of more sustainable and economic ways of doing them, to have more participation in them through open calls, and to use some of our open source software mechanisms to make it easier and faster to develop the exhibitions. And so now I want to just quickly go back to give you a quick introduction to the collections resources that we have available. And then I guess I will have a little time for questions, and then I can zero in on helping you add items to these collections from home and use the collections from home. So under our collections tab, we have it's basically a prototype. It's very inelegant right now because we need people to use it and give us some feedback so we can begin to build this collections resource out so that it will better serve all of you. We have two different types of collections. We have what's called the library and museums collections, and we also have the crowdsourced collections. So the library and museum collections come from the Digital Public Library of America. And the Digital Public Library of America has been engaged in a national scale effort to digitize, help museums and libraries digitize and share publicly in an open source system many of their objects. And at the moment, they have times that they take in new materials about 4 times a year. Museums and libraries around the country are working through hubs to digitize portions of their collections and share them through the Digital Public Library of America. There are small institutions from local historic houses, libraries, archives. There are also very large institutions like the Smithsonian who share objects through this interface. And they become free and available to be culled through. So we have culled through them. And what you're seeing here is a search we developed to share the objects that are related to knitting and crochet in these huge multi-source collections that cover every type of subject matter in the universe. So when you look at these objects, we are not going through them. Our organization is focused mostly on hand knitting and hand crocheting, but we are not going through the information that we call from Digital Public Library of America related to knitting and crochet to pull out things that are not according to our mission. So it's really everything in here. And what's exciting about it is that because it's such an eclectic series of items that are in the Digital Public Library of America collection, um, you can really see how totally integral to the fabric of our social life, political life, economic life, etc. Knitting and crochet always were and still are. And when you look at these objects, you can search them by searching here. When you look at the objects and click on them, the object itself, it will take you to the original collection where this object is located. So even though we're sharing it through our interface, it's never detached from its original collection. And that enables you in your living room as a scholar, researcher, or simply an interested person who wants to be inspired by historical knitting to really connect with these original collections and enter onto a path of discovery yourself. And as you can see here, I mean, this reminds me of the artwork that Grant had shared before by LaToya Ruby Frazier. This shows young children basically knitting to support themselves. And one of the things that you will discover in these archives is the stories are not always stories that are easy to read because it is the real history. So there is the history of knitting as labor, knitting as pastime, knitting as competition, knitting, as rehabilitation. You will really find every type of story. And we feel like delivering these items makes it possible for anyone to do all types of exciting and new research using these materials and having them accessible in a way that they haven't been before. And we're very hopeful that a lot of new scholarship and enjoyment can result. So I'm going to go back to here and just search and show that very quickly that in addition to most of these are coming in sort of by state. So you can search by state and actually learn a lot about regional knitting and crochet through history. But if we go to Colorado Crochet, which I did earlier, I was kind of interested in this. Let's see, where did it go? Okay, so here's a filet edge triangle design. And this is a nice example of what can happen when museums really do care about providing you with a full record of information about a particular object. This is not typical, but I did really like this example. So this is an example of filet crochet that is from the History of Colorado online collection. And I love that it is story. I mean, it tells you who made the piece, which oftentimes is not available. Was never documented. It talks to you about what filet crochet is and how it is done, which is unusual to have information about the techniques and materials. It gives you some resources that you can look at yourself for how to find out more about filet crochet. And one thing I also especially like is that this particular organization is taking the work of museums very seriously, and they have developed this very thoughtful History Colorado anti-racism work, grounding virtues, goals, and accountability. And I really do think that this is great because not only when you're using this archive, you see all the ways that we need to fill in and correct and add to the missing histories. But you also get to see firsthand what institutions are doing, museum institutions and history institutions are doing to try to do this work correctly. And so it's very heartening, and it feels very immediate as you're looking through the records of these various institutions. You can get a very good feeling for where they're coming from and what types of work they're doing to make their collections more available and representative. So in our own collection, in addition to offering this interface, which takes you directly from your living room into various library and museum collections through Digital Public Library of America, we at Center for Knit and Crochet are trying to build a companion collection. So this companion collection would be essentially the siblings, the sisters and brothers of the objects currently in museums. And these are all the things that are in our closets and drawers, things that we have at home. So it's very easy to add to this collection. Right now, it only has 77 objects in it. And we are working hard to get the word out that this collection exists. So what do we want you to have people add here? Literally, this collection is for you to use to document your own knit and crochet history and share it with others. So it's free to add to this. You do not have to be a member of our organization to use it or add to it. You can tell your own story and document your own history. And, you know, there are all types of objects in here already. But basically, you can add anything that you have, whether it's a family object or something you've made yourself that you would like to share. And I think that may get me pretty much to my 20 minutes, but I would certainly like to have questions and comments from anyone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think I actually have a question. I guess I'm wondering what, I love that this is a form of digital preservation, but I also am curious about what if the center has any ideas for how people can preserve their objects in the future besides this digital platform. Like if they want an object to be in an institution where it would be cared for instance, or yeah, I guess I'm curious if you guys do any of that kind of work.
Well, we are struggling with that right now. I mean, we are a very small organization and we do have some growing pains. And one of them is that we would like to be able to offer lists to people of local places where they could look to for to offer their items. And so we will be developing that, but we also are doing some outreach to guilds and groups and trying to engage local knitting guild members in and help them to do more of their own local preservation within their organization. And we believe that if we can encourage people to capture the information that's needed about the knitting and crochet they have now within their own communities and locally, almost as a citizen archivist model, that that we won't encounter the same problems in the future that we are encountering now in looking at these piecemeal histories that museums often have for a whole variety of reasons. So yes, we do want to help support this, and we envision that as a growth area for our organization. A lot of people are interested in actual preservation information. So how would I pack my um, textiles for preservation? And we have thought long and hard about this, and we'll probably do some educational videos about this in the future. But we will also try to simply aggregate reliable resources for that. So again, operating as this host or sharer or aggregator of useful information and collections, that we would begin to point people in directions where this work has already been done very well, so that they could go there and learn about it rather than trying to reinvent everything, because there are some wonderful resources available. So that is a growth area for us, definitely.
That's great. Some other questions have popped up in the chat. Well, Suzanne Thompson asks, could you show us the contribution page where people upload their information?
Yes, of course. And we'll go over that shortly too, because I'm going to show you how to do this. So when we go to the crowdsource collection, you can go down to the place where it says contribute. And there's a very easy form to fill out. If you are interested in finding out, we do have documentation on Google, and you can see here, I need instructions for filling out the online contribution form. What are the criteria? Certainly we'll help you with the online contribution form, and you're welcome to look at the criteria. But essentially, we're not trying to exclude things at this point. We're the criteria we developed to try to suggest things that lots of people might have or might be able to add. But you should not feel limited by that. It's mostly just to stimulate your thoughts that, hey, I might have something. And really, we don't know what you're going to want to add. And we don't want to constrain what you want to add. We want to create a resource that is as alive as the community who uses it. And we want everyone to feel welcome to put the things on that are meaningful to them with those stories. So I didn't want to encourage you to read up too heavily on criteria, but it is very simple to add. And I don't know if I'm at my 20-minute limit when running over into the tutorial, but I will show you how to add your items. It's pretty straightforward.
It seems like, let's see, there's one more question on, maybe we could answer and then go into the tutorial.
Okay.
Many knitters and crocheters document their objects on Ravelry. Have you thought about linking or partnering with them?
We have thought about this many times, and I recently gave a guild program that asked me, couldn't we invent a way to download all the information that somebody's already typed into Ravelry into this database? So that is something we need to look at more. And to think more about how to make it easy for people in a variety of ways to use this system. As I mentioned, it is kind of a test case. So this is definitely on our radar in terms of when we do our next iteration or we make improvements to this, we do need to know what you want. So having people who are interested in being able to use the two systems together is something we will definitely explore. And we are very interested in any kind of feedback as you use this system. The only way we will be able to build it better is if we hear from you about what you liked and didn't like, things that you think would make it easier. It is pretty rough. So it's a beta test. So we definitely want to hear from you about your experiences, and we can help you too. So if you're having problems, just email us on the website. There are links there, and we can even set up an appointment to help you or to talk with you about helping your group use this system.
Okay, there's a lot of questions about what people can submit to the collections, or if they're or if international backgrounds would be accepted, and also if there is a place for a what is it description if you're unsure. So perhaps I'm not sure if any of those questions might be answered in your tutorial, but
Oh, okay. So I'll just quickly go through. We're interested in everything, and crocheted pot holders sound awesome. I would love to see them. Yes, international is great. I was careful to talk about the objects that we have available in the library and museum collections as being US objects, because they are from the Digital Public Library of America. So, but our collection is not limited that way. We definitely want and actually have international objects, even in the 77 objects that we have now. So, and I'll show you a couple of those. So absolutely, yeah, bring it on, totally. Is there a place to do a what is it for inherited items we can't name? We don't have a place to query that, but we do not expect you to know everything about the objects. So we want this resource to be used by your family members, you know, makers, families of makers. The whole idea behind it is, you know, even for the museum side, is we want to merge these expertises. So even if you have your grandmother's doilies and you know nothing about the doilies, there's going to be somebody who looks at those doilies that knows everything about how they are made. And eventually we want to be able to merge those knowledge bases. So, you know, we're not quite sure how that will happen, but we know that if somebody knows about those doilies, or if you put a query in there and say, I don't know what these are, but I would really like somebody to get back to me, we can figure out how to make that happen.
okay, thank you everyone. If you want, you can move on to the tutorial.
Oh, this is super quick, and I hope it won't be, I mean, we'll be happy to help anybody, but essentially you're just going to upload images, and I have a little sheet here that's, you know, some things I thought about, you know, when I do my own data entry here. Some of the things that I like to do, or I like to set up a little space for myself to work. So maybe I'll have a couple of objects that I want to add. So, you know, we want anyone to be able to use this: makers, families of makers, guilds and craft groups, collectors, private collectors, museums, and other cultural organizations. And by adding your things, you're basically creating a whole new universe of possibility for, you know, enjoyment, study, research. So, what kinds of items can be added? Anything, garments, accessories, housewares, original artworks and designs. You'll see all of these in the collection now. Samples and swatches, edgings, photographs, documents, toys, etc. So the things that have been added, we'll just quickly look at them. It's a little hard to find, but you click on view all items and it will tell you everything that's in here. So one of the things that, you know, people have different styles of documenting things. I like to write a lot of information. Other people don't like to write a lot of information, and it's perfectly fine. This is one of my favorite objects that doesn't have a lot of information, and it is from an international contributor. She is from Japan, and she's added quite a few objects. She found Suzanne's social media feed and got interested in what we were doing. Her name is Teruko Hattori. Oh, her mother's name is Teruko Hattori. So this is called a bicolored snood. And I just love looking at all of her things. She says, my mother made this so that I can wear it with my colorless midnight navy blue woolen top that looks quite formal with skinny wool pants of white or beige. Adding this around the neck was to make it possible to wear it more casually. The technique is simple and primitive. My mother is a rough, not minute person. She doesn't care for details being flawed. Thus, this is not a good example for careful knitters. And I love this because everything she writes is just so much about her relationship and love between, her and her mother, and the way that her mother observed her needs and knitted for them, and how much pleasure she takes in coordinating these things that her mother's made for her with outfits that she has. And I think 100 years from now, this will still feel fresh and intriguing, even though we don't know every last detail about this particular object. The story will still have meaning and be resonant. And the fact that she's doing this across a language barrier, I was thinking about that this week. We should and could find ways, perhaps with your help as a community, to make it possible for people to enter their data in their own language. I don't know quite what the particularities of this are, but with Google Translate, it should be very easy for people to be able to read something, even if it's not in English. So in looking ahead at how we can make this more accessible, that would be one thing I would be interested in exploring. So, you can see in here, there are toys, there are doilies, there are yarn bombs with, just beautiful stories associated with them. I highly encourage you to take a look at the things. Their edgings, things don't have to be in perfect condition to be shown here. It's not about perfection. It's about recording history and sharing what you have. We can still learn things from things that need mending. There are samples, there are works of art. You can see some of the objects aren't in perfect condition, but they're still interesting to people who make edgings. All types of things, tools, etc. So I hope that you will feel inspired to, yarn bombs are things that are very transitory. Maybe we only have images now to record their existence, but if we don't put the images somewhere in a collection, then it will be very hard for us to remember them later on. So anyway, any other questions? Okay, I'll go quickly back to my list of how to add. So when I add, all you need is a digital camera. So it can just be, use your cell phone. It's fine. I've done all my photographs on my cell phone. I like to have a flat surface that I can lay the object out on so that it makes it easier for me to photograph it. I measure it using a tape measure or ruler. Some types of basic measurements are helpful. So, how long is the sweater? How long are the sleeves? People who make things know the measurements that are typical. And if you don't, it's just helpful to have some sense of scale. You can have a notepad or pencil and pen by your side to make some notes. So when you're typing things in, you can remember what you wanted to say. If you use a solid backdrop of some sort, like a clean sheet or something, that helps take a picture that's easier for someone to see than if it's on a patterned background. You can put a coin or a book or another recognizable object that people have commonly in their environment to show the scale of something. You could include digital versions of family photos. That's really nice for people to be able to see whose object it is or who made it. Photos of the object on someone are helpful or in a typical setting if it's a domestic object. Again, because we get a sense of, like Grant was talking about, the things that, are in our environments. Notes from conversations you might have had or memories that you have of talking with the person who made the object and what it means to you. We have spaces here for adding your photos, giving a brief description of what it is. For example, you know, this is a Norwegian ski hat or Norwegian style ski hat, or a, you know, a crocheted market bag or whatever. List the creator's name, the year that it was made. If you know, circa is also fine. The dimensions, this is kind of awkward language, which you can't really change, but essentially the measurements of the object roughly. Then writing a summary about it, you know, it can be very short, like the one I read to you, but it can include as much detail as you like. Your name as you would like it to appear. You can create some tags for it that might help people to find it based on common terminology, you know, or something, you know, that you know about it. And that can be augmented later on if need be. Your email, and then you can put in information about how to contact you. You have to click publish my contribution on the web in order for us to publish it, etc. Agree to our terms and conditions, which are our privacy policy, and then click contribute. And we have to approve it. That is just a very perfunctory process of us, you know, basically receiving a message that someone's contributed something and going in and saying, yes, we approve it to be shared. So it's a very simple process, we hope, but we can certainly help anyone who has questions, and hopefully it will be reasonably easy for you to add. After you finish adding, you will be asked to set up an account, and that means basically with your email and a password, and we can then contact you if we have questions about your object. In addition, you can also delete your account and all the objects associated with it at any time you desire. And finally, I just wanted to say that we know that adding things takes time, and we're grateful for that. So anyone who is adding things, we really appreciate it, and we know that it is it's a very generous act. So thank you in advance. Okay, I see there's some new messages.
There's one question, there's lots of praise. And there's one question that asks, can you edit or add to a contribution later?
You should be able to. Now, we recently had a little issue with this. There was a glitch in the software in a recent update that made it difficult, but that has been fixed. So now I believe you can go in and edit your object. So, but if you have trouble doing that, you can contact us and we can double check and make sure that the fix is still working. But the idea is that you would be able to do that.
Okay, are there any other questions before we wrap up for either presenter? So still mostly just reading lots of excitement in the chat, excitement to be able, like the contribution of personal stories is really wonderful. And some people are already working on projects of sorting through their grandmother's crochet, or Heather says that. And Suzanne suggested we could present what is it questions to the CKC social media followers.
Oh, that's a great suggestion, Suzanne. That is a really great suggestion. But yes, you know, we really hope that will encourage you to try to use this resource, share the existence of it so we can grow this collection, and also that, you know, what we're doing will be useful to many of you in all your work and enjoyment of textiles. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you today.
Yes, thank you so much for coming, Jennifer. And also thank you to Grant for presenting your work to us. This is a really fun session.
All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah.